A medieval army of 10,000 men needed 14,000 kilograms of food every single day just to keep moving. With no central supply chains, soldiers faced a grim choice: forage, steal, or starve. What was actually in their cooking pots, and how did a simple biscuit shape the wars that defined an era? The answer begins with the crushing reality of the ration. A prosperous English soldier in the 14th century received roughly 900 grams, 2 pounds of bread per day as his base. In many campaigns, it was the only thing the crown reliably delivered. Yet each man needed at least 1.4 kilograms of total food daily to function. During hard marching or active combat, that number climbed to nearly 2.3 kilograms. No medieval kingdom had the infrastructure to guarantee that, so the soldier carried it himself. Baking fresh bread in the field was nearly impossible. Dough needs time, ovens need permanence. A medieval army in motion had neither. The solution was hardtack: flour, water and salt baked into flat, dense rounds, then baked a second time to force out every trace of moisture. The result was nearly indistinguishable from stone. You could not bite it dry without risking your teeth. Standard practice was to soak it in water, broth or ale until it softened enough to chew. A soldier carrying several rounds could survive for days without a fire, without a camp kitchen, without any supply line at all. But hardtack alone kept a man alive. It did not keep him fighting. So what else went into that cooking pot, and how did a soldier on a 12-hour march actually get it there? If bread was the foundation, pottage was the daily reality of medieval military life. Pottage was not a recipe, it was a method. Whatever was available, grains, dried peas, lentils, cabbage, leeks, onions, went into a pot of water and boiled until the whole thing became a thick, uniform mass. The simplest version was boiled grain with salt. Better versions included salted pork, dried fish, or whatever vegetables had been foraged that day. Frumenti, thick pottage made with wheat, broth, egg yolks and spices, appeared on noble tables. The common soldier ate something far thinner. A 2019 study from the University of Bristol chemically analysed pottery fragments from a medieval English village. The most common meal was a stew of beef or mutton with cabbage and leek. The key advantage was flexibility. When supplies were adequate, it tasted like a proper meal. When supplies ran thin, you added water and kept stirring. Now you know what the medieval soldier ate, but none of that answers the question of what he drank, and why the answer kept entire armies alive. Water could kill you. Every medieval soldier knew this from experience. Rivers near an army's camp became contaminated within days. With thousands of men, hundreds of horses and open latrines, the water downstream was a death sentence. Dysentery incapacitated entire units faster than enemy arrows. So medieval soldiers drank ale, not the strong amber beer we know today. Medieval ale had an alcohol content of roughly 1%, brewed from barley or oats. Unfiltered and cloudy with grain sediment, it looked closer to liquid porridge than a modern drink. The fermentation process made it microbiologically safer than river water. Even children in medieval Europe drank small ale daily. When the alternative could kill you within a week, cloudy, grain-thick ale was not a luxury. It was medicine. The quantities consumed were extraordinary. English and Danish sailors in the 16th century received a standard ration of 1 imperial gallon, 4.5 litres of ale per day. Polish peasants consumed up to 3 litres daily. At Westminster Abbey, each monk received a full gallon every single day. Monks were not digging siege trenches or marching in 25-kilogram, 55-pound armour. A lay also contributed roughly 1,500 calories per gallon. Combined with hardtack and pottage, this pushed daily intake close to 4,000 to 5,000 calories needed under campaign conditions. In southern Europe, France, Italy and Spain, wine replaced ale for those who could obtain it. The common English foot soldier received ale. Or he received nothing. Bread, pottage, ale, this was the core, but none of it contained enough protein to sustain a man through weeks of combat. So where did his meat come from, and why does the answer involve a law that almost everyone ignored? Meat was the rarest item on the medieval soldiers' table. It was also the most urgently needed. The official crown ration included salted pork or dried herring. Salted pork was produced by layering thin cuts between beds of salt and flooding the container with brine. Done correctly, it lasted months. Dried and salted herring from the North Sea was the primary protein source for English armies throughout the 100 Years' War. Cheap, abundant, and nearly indestructible in storage. Live cattle followed medieval armies on the march as a walking food supply. Before a major engagement or when supplies hit a critical low, animals were slaughtered on the spot. Soldiers ate everything: meat, organs, tails, boiled into broth for the communal pot. But official rations covered only part of what a soldier actually consumed. The rest came from hunting, quietly and illegally. In peacetime England, hunting deer or large game on the Lord's land was punishable by mutilation. Hands cut off, eyes removed. For a conscript 4 weeks into thin pottage and stale hardtack, that law became significantly easier to disregard. Men who had spent years quietly poaching before the war brought those skills directly onto campaign. Fishing during halts was universal. Military records document soldiers eating snails, frogs, and anything catchable without dedicated weapons. The problem was never quality, it was consistency. A foraging party sent ahead of 10,000 hungry men came back through stripped countryside. And when the meat disappeared entirely, a soldier still needed something to prevent his body from failing. So what filled that gap, and why was a handful of onions sometimes worth more than a sword? Fresh vegetables were not rationed to medieval soldiers. They were expected to be found, grown or taken. The staples were onions, garlic, leeks, cabbage, turnips, parsnips and dried peas or beans. All stored well, travelled easily in dry form and went directly into the pottage pot without preparation. Garlic was eaten raw by soldiers throughout medieval Europe. Medieval commanders had no knowledge of biochemistry. They knew from experience that it seemed to reduce infections and kept men on their feet longer. Garlic contains allicin, a compound with genuine antimicrobial properties, and in men being cut regularly, eating it daily likely made a measurable difference. When an army established a longer encampment, soldiers planted vegetables around the perimeter: leeks, lettuce, fast-growing herbs, anything that produced food within a few weeks. It served as nutrition and kept idle men occupied between engagements. Foraging from the landscape was a critical daily skill. Medieval soldiers were almost universally from rural backgrounds. They knew which plants were edible, where wild garlic grew in spring, which mushrooms were safe. Wild berries, sorrel, nettles, all of it went into the pot when supply had stopped arriving. Spices were an entirely different world. 1 pound, 450 grams of saffron in 14th century England cost as much as a horse. The common soldier never touched them. What he had instead were 3 ingredients available almost anywhere in Europe, and they made the difference between enduring a meal and actually being able to finish it: salt, vinegar, and mustard. The medieval soldier's flavour trinity, and each one did more than improve the taste. Salt was not a seasoning, it was a strategic resource. Every piece of salted pork, every dried fish ration existed because salt had made it survivable on the march. Edward I's procurement records for his 1294 French campaign list salt alongside grain and cattle as a non-negotiable supply item. Unsalted pottage was nearly inedible. Men on campaign who ran out of salt reported declining morale within days, not because they were hungry, but because the food became genuinely difficult to force down. Vinegar was the second pillar. Mixed with water, it was marginally safer to drink than plain river water. Added to preserved meat, it extended shelf life by several additional days. Supply records from both English and French armies during the 100 Years' War list vinegar barrels as standard procurement, alongside grain, not alongside wine. Mustard was the third. Mustard seeds grew throughout Europe and required nothing more than a stone to grind into paste. It added heat and sharpness to cold hardtack and salted fish that had been sitting in a barrel for 3 months. 3 ingredients, near zero weight, near zero cost, the difference between a soldier who finished his ration and one who left it in the bowl. Behind all of this, the bread, the pottage, the ale, the salted herring, sat the question. Every medieval commander faced the moment his army left the gate. How do you actually get all of it to the men who need it when you have no roads, no warehouses, and no system? This was medieval warfare's most persistent crisis, not the enemy, the food. Medieval armies had no centralized supply system, no permanent granary network, no guaranteed delivery routes. Each commander improvised differently, campaign by campaign. The Carolingians, Charlemagne's dynasty in the 8th century, required every soldier to arrive carrying enough food for 3 months. After 3 months, the crown took over. In practice, a soldier's pack was already weighing him down before the campaign began. The crown supplemented this through purchase and requisition. Before Edward I's campaign in 1294, royal officials procured cattle, swine, salt and grain directly from English farms, sometimes at market price, sometimes at a price the farmer had no power to refuse. What this created in practice was a crawling army. Medieval forces moved at only 8 to 16 kilometers or 5 to 10 miles per day, because supply parties needed to forage constantly on both flanks. Each horse needed 9 kilograms or 20 pounds of feed daily. An army with 2,000 horses required 18,000 kilograms of fodder every day for the animals alone. The mathematics became catastrophic at Agincourt in October 1415. Henry V left Harfleur with a depleted army and nearly no supplies, marching toward Calais. The French intercepted him not because Henry wanted a battle. His men had been eating stripped countryside for weeks. Fighting was more survivable than continuing to starve on the march. The English won, but the food crisis that forced that battle was as responsible for the outcome as anything that happened on the field. What keeps coming back is the same question we started with: what was actually in that pot? The answer changed dramatically depending on who was doing the cooking. The basic unit of medieval military cooking was not the regiment or the company. It was the mess group, 4 to 8 men who marched together, camped together and shared a single iron cauldron. The cauldron was among the most valuable objects in the pack. Lose your sword and you could take one from a dead enemy. Lose your cauldron and your group had no means of cooking anything at all. The moment camp was established, the cauldron went on the fire. One man collected wood, another drew water, a third prepared whatever ingredients were available. The cooking was communal, the eating was communal. Men who fought beside each other ate beside each other. The knight travelled with a squire or servant who handled provisions separately. At the siege of Harfleur in 1415, Henry V's personal supply records show purchases of pepper, fine wine and white wheat bread. His archers were soaking hardtack in ditch water. Each soldier's personal kit was minimal: a wooden bowl, a spoon, a knife that served equally for eating, cutting rope and occasionally fighting. No plates, no forks. Archaeologists have found these objects across former campaign sites from France to the Holy Land. Worn, simple, sometimes scratched with the owner's initials. Each one evidence of a specific man answering the same question, night after night: what was actually in that pot? Not every medieval army fed itself the same way. The differences reveal exactly how much food determined military outcomes. The Mongol armies of Genghis Khan were built entirely for speed. Each warrior carried dried strips of horse meat and blood powder, drawn from a living horse's neck vein, dried, and dissolved in cold water when needed. A Mongol soldier could cover 160 kilometers or 100 miles in a single day without stopping to forage or cook. The horse was the food system, the transport system, and the emergency ration. The Ottoman janissaries, established under Murad I in the 14th century, operated on the opposite principle. The cooking pot was the regiment. The company's senior officer held the formal title of soup cook. The regimental battle standard was a cooking pot, not a flag. When janissaries mutinied, they overturned the communal cauldron and refused to eat from it. No other army gave food that level of institutional weight. The English longbowmen at Agincourt, standing in a muddy field on a cold October morning, 3 weeks into hardtack and stripped countryside, sat somewhere between these two extremes. Not efficient enough to move like a Mongol, not organised enough to eat like a janissary. Most days he ate. Some days he did not, and when the food ran out for long enough, the consequences were documented in detail that still makes difficult reading. A soldier's life was not composed entirely of hardtack and thin pottage. There were moments when the food changed, and those moments were managed with deliberate precision. After a major victory, the live cattle following the army were slaughtered. Fresh meat went into every pot. Better ale or wine appeared from the supply wagons. Men who had just survived something catastrophic ate something that reminded them why survival was worth the effort. Religious feast days punctuated the campaign calendar. Christmas, Easter, the feast days of patron saints. On these occasions, even common soldiers received better bread, a larger meat portion, and an extra ration of ale. Carolingian military regulations from the 8th century explicitly required commanders to provide improved rations on major feast days, not charity. Operational management. Food also functioned as a direct reward. After exceptional performance in battle or during a difficult siege, units received double rations or access to quality provisions the supply train normally kept sealed. Dried fruit, honey and pepper appeared on soldiers' tables only as prizes. Plunder was the unofficial version. An army that sacked a prosperous town ate exceptionally well for several days. The prospect of a good sack was a deliberate military incentive, used to attract men who had no other guarantee of adequate food, but behind every feast was the knowledge of what happened when the food ran out completely. In the Middle Ages, it ran out often, and what followed was documented in enough detail to be genuinely disturbing. When supply lines broke, and in medieval warfare they broke constantly, the soldier's relationship with food became something else entirely. The first response was ration reduction. Half portions, then quarter portions. The ale disappeared first, then the salted meat. Men continued on hardtack and water until the hardtack ran out too. Then the foraging turned desperate. Soldiers stripped bark from trees and boiled it. They dug up roots and ate them raw. They collected nettles, acorns and sorrel, anything with caloric value within walking distance. The transport animals went next. Oxen first, the slowest and least tactically valuable. Then pack horses. In extreme cases, war horses. A knight's destrier represented years of training and an investment equivalent to a small farm. Eating one was an act of desperation understood by every man present. Leather followed. Soldiers boiled belts, sandal straps, shield covers and horse harness. The resulting liquid provided almost no nutrition, but it was warm, and it occupied the stomach for a few more hours. At the siege of Antioch in 1098, after months of total supply collapse, the chronicler Albert of Aachen documents crusaders eating the bodies of dead enemies found outside the walls. Fulcher of Chartres, who was physically present, confirmed it. These were not isolated incidents, they were the documented outcome of a food system with no margin for failure. The gap between a medieval soldier's daily meal and absolute starvation was never as wide as it appeared. One broken supply route, one failed foraging party, one unexpected siege, and the distance collapsed entirely. What was in that cooking pot was never just a question about food, it was a question about whether the army still existed the following week. Food did not just fuel medieval armies, it decided who won. Subscribe, more medieval history coming.